my brother's hand cracked across my face, so hard the sting burned into my jaw, and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. The room went silent, frozen in that suspended second where everyone at the table held their breath, forks hovering above plates of roast beef and mashed potatoes. The crystal chandelier trembled slightly from the force of his slap, casting fractured light across the polished oak table. For a moment, I thought someone would gasp. Maybe my mother would stand, maybe my father would demand order. But no, my parents just smiled. My mother's lips curled like she had witnessed a long-awaited performance, and my father's eyes glimmered with quiet satisfaction, as if this slap had been the verdict in a trial they had engineered long ago. My name is Victoria Harris. I was 32 years old on that night, and in that instant, I understood what I had always feared deep in my bones. I was not a daughter at this table. I was an intruder they tolerated until the moment they could watch me be destroyed. The laughter of cousins and distant relatives, loud just moments before, dissolved into an eerie hush. The clinking of glasses, the hum of background jazz. Even the ticking grandfather clock in the corner seemed to vanish. All that remained was the burning ache in my cheek, the smirk on Ethan's face, and the cruel serenity in my parents' smiles. "You heard me," Ethan barked, his voice cracking through the silence. "Get out of my house." He stood tall, 35 years old, and bloated from years of indulgence, his hand still quivering with the satisfaction of the strike. The word house echoed in my mind, reverberating through me, twisting like a blade. This house had belonged to our grandparents, a place of warm Sunday dinners and whispered bedtime stories, a place my name was etched into by their will and their love. Yet here I was, slapped, humiliated, told to leave what was legally mine, while my parents looked on with approval. The betrayal burned hotter than the slap. My cheek would heal, the red mark would fade, but the image of my mother's smile tight, sharp, entertained, would scar deeper than any bruise. My father leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach, like a judge satisfied after passing sentence. He did not need to say anything. His silence, coupled with that thin smirk, screamed louder than any words. "You deserve this, Victoria." I sat, frozen, hand pressed against my throbbing skin, eyes darting around the table. Not a single relative moved, not an aunt, not a cousin. Some lowered their eyes to their plates. Others took hurried sips of wine. Complicity was easier than courage. The air smelled of roasted meat, buttery rolls, and betrayal. My pulse thudded in my ears, each beat a reminder that I was alive but barely tolerated. In that silence, a thought rooted itself in me. This was not just Ethan's violence. This was my parents' theater. They had built the stage, handed him the script, and now watched the performance with satisfaction. The dinner, the invitations, the perfect setting. It was all orchestrated to corner me, to make me small, to remind me that despite the ink on the deed, despite the love my grandparents had poured into me, I was nothing in their eyes but a nuisance to be erased. The pain in my cheek sharpened when I tried to speak, but my voice still came out low and shaking. "This isn't your house, Ethan." For a heartbeat, hope flickered that maybe the truth would pierce the room, that someone would remember the will, the law, the fairness of what was written. But Ethan only laughed, a dark, guttural sound, and my mother's laugh chimed in light and cruel. "Oh, Victoria," she said softly, almost sweetly, "don't ruin dinner with your dramatics." My father's smirk widened. The verdict was sealed. In that moment, humiliation washed over me like ice water searing through veins already hot with rage. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But more than anything, I wanted to remember. Every smirk, every laugh, every bite of roast beef, taken while I sat marked with my brother's hand, I carved it all into my memory. Because one day I promised myself they would choke on this arrogance. That slap was not just an act of violence. It was a declaration of war. I sat there with my cheek still stinging. But before that moment unraveled into humiliation, I had convinced myself that coming here was the right choice. I had built a life in Dallas, steady work, as a designer, my own apartment with plants in every window, a circle of friends who respected me. I did not need this family to survive, but blood ties have a way of pulling you back, especially when the house that held your childhood still stands promising memories that no longer exist. Driving 2 hours down the highway, I had carried a casserole on the seat beside me, the same dish my grandmother used to make. I wanted to show up with something more than just my presence to prove that even after years of distance, I was still willing to contribute, still willing to belong. The closer I got to the estate, the more the sun dipped into the horizon, painting the stone walls in gold and shadow. It looked majestic from the outside, but to me, it was a fortress with locked doors disguised as smiles. When I walked in, everything shimmered with a false warmth. Laughter echoed through the dining room glasses. Clinked candles glowed. Ethan's voice boomed above everyone else's. The self-proclaimed host holding court at the table, as though the deed had his name etched on it. My mother brushed a kiss across my cheek, the scent of wine heavy on her breath, and whispered something that sliced sharper than any knife. "Try not to cause trouble tonight." My father barely looked at me, his posture rigid by the fireplace, his nod less like welcome and more like permission to enter enemy territory. For a flicker of a moment, I tried to play along. I slipped into my seat, the same table where my grandmother once blessed meals, where my grandfather carved turkeys with steady hands. The silverware glimmered, the plates gleamed, and I let myself pretend it was a normal family dinner. I laughed politely at a cousin's story, reached for bread rolls, and tried to swallow the bitterness rising in my throat. But the cracks appeared quickly. Ethan turned the conversation toward me, his tone dripping with contempt disguised as humor. "Still doing that color-picking thing you call a job?" he sneered. A few relatives chuckled awkwardly. My mother smiled indulgently at him. "He's always had such confidence," she said, as if his arrogance were something noble. My father carved into his steak with deliberate force, not bothering to defend me, not even meeting my eyes. The casserole I had brought sat untouched at the far end of the table, a silent reminder that nothing I offered would ever be enough. My career, my independence, my success in the city, none of it mattered here. In this house, Ethan's empty boasts about ventures that never existed outweighed years of my real hard work. And I played my part, nodding, smiling faintly, holding myself together while the ground beneath me cracked open. Looking back, I see it clearly. The stage had been set long before the slap. Every laugh, every toast, every polite dismissal of me was the overture to the performance they had been waiting for. That night was never about dinner. It was about putting me in my place. False normalcy was their greatest weapon. The warm glow of candles, the polished wood of the table, the easy chatter, it was all camouflage for the cruelty waiting underneath. I walked into that house, still hoping for family, but what I found was theater scripted and sharpened against me. The sting on my cheek had barely begun to fade when Ethan's voice filled the silence again. Harsher, louder, determined to make sure everyone at that table knew exactly where I stood, or rather where he thought I stood. "You heard me," he repeated, his words slicing through the air like glass shattering. "Get out of my house. You don't belong here." His chest heaved, his hand still trembling with the leftover thrill of the slap. His eyes bloodshot with a mix of rage and triumph. I straightened in my chair, my hand still against my burning skin, but my voice steadier this time. "This isn't your house, Ethan." I said the words steady, almost calm, though my pulse pounded in my ears. "You know whose name is on the deed." My words were not just for him. They were for everyone sitting at that table, for every relative who chose to look away. But before I could continue, my mother's laugh cut me off. "Victoria, don't ruin dinner with your dramatics," Linda said, sipping her wine as if my humiliation were a minor inconvenience. Her tone was airy, dismissive, the kind a hostess might use to quiet a child whining in church. "Your brother has been under so much stress. Can't you see that? Don't provoke him." Stress. My voice cracked with disbelief. "He just hit me." I pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against the wood floor, but my father's voice snapped like a whip. "Sit down," Charles commanded, his eyes narrowing in warning. His hand gripped the table edge, knuckles white. "Don't make a scene. You always do this, you exaggerate. You embarrass this family." My heart thudded painfully. Exaggerate, embarrass. Words they had used my whole life to shrink me, to make me doubt my own pain. Gaslighting wrapped around me like chains squeezing tighter with each smile, each nod of agreement from the others at the table. Ethan leaned closer, his breath thick with whiskey. "You heard Dad. Sit down. Or better yet, stand up and walk out. You've always thought you were better than us, haven't you? Living in Dallas, working some meaningless job, pretending you're successful. But this house, this family doesn't need you. It never did." A cousin coughed, trying to cut the tension, but no one spoke in my defense. Forks clinked softly against plates as if the performance had resumed, and I was the only one off script. My casserole remained untouched, a metaphor too sharp to ignore. My contributions were invisible, my efforts disregarded. "I belong here as much as anyone," I said, my voice trembling but firm. Grandma and Grandpa made sure of that. They left this house to me, and you all know it. I let my gaze fall on each of them, on my mother, whose smile thinned, on my father, whose silence screamed approval for Ethan, on the cousins who dropped their eyes to their plates rather than meet mine. Ethan's laugh rose again, cruel and guttural. "That old will. That's just paper. What matters is who actually lives here, who actually runs things. And that's me." He jabbed his finger at his chest, then at me. You're just a guest, an unwanted one." My father's voice rumbled low, steady, final. Your brother is right. This house has always been for family. If you can't accept that, maybe you shouldn't come back. For a moment, the room spun. My father's words weren't careless. They were deliberate. A sentence passed down in front of an audience, a public stripping of my place at the table. Ethan leaned back, satisfied, sipping his drink, as if he had won a prize fight. My mother's smile flickered just enough to show the triumph she didn't bother to hide. Humiliation pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. But beneath it, something sharper stirred. Rage. Resolve. I looked at each of them again, memorizing the way their faces gleamed in the candlelight. How none of them lifted a hand, none of them spoke in my defense. They had chosen their side. This isn't over, I whispered more to myself than to them. But Ethan heard and his smirk widened. You're right, he said, his voice low and venomous. It's only just beginning. The room erupted again with the sounds of dinner glasses, clinking forks, scraping plates. Shallow laughter resuming like nothing had happened. But for me, the dinner was over. What had started as a slap was now a declaration this family intended to erase me. They thought they had broken me. Instead, they had woken something far more dangerous. The echoes of that dinner table humiliation clung to me long after the plates were cleared, long after I drove back through the dark highways with the taste of blood still on my tongue. Sitting alone in my apartment days later, I began piecing together memories that I had spent years trying to bury. They rose unbidden, sharper now in the wake of Ethan's slap and my parents' smiles. The truth was that night hadn't started anything. It had only confirmed a pattern woven into my life since childhood. I remembered being 8 years old, standing in the school auditorium with a spelling bee ribbon in my hand. I had studied for weeks, writing words across scraps of paper, whispering syllables under my breath until I fell asleep. When I won, I thought my parents would finally look at me with pride. Ethan had been grounded that week for setting off firecrackers in the garage, so I thought maybe this time my moment would matter. But when the applause ended and I looked out into the crowd, only my grandmother was there, her hands clapping furiously, her smile radiant. My parents hadn't come. Later, when I showed them the ribbon, my mother smiled distractedly and said, "That's nice, dear, but Ethan had a tough week. Let's not rub it in." My father didn't even look up from his newspaper. By 14, I had straight A's and a quiet determination to earn a scholarship. Ethan, 2 years older, was already skipping classes and smoking behind the football bleachers. Yet in our house, his report cards were explained away as teachers being too hard, while my achievements were brushed aside as expected. I learned early that perfection from me was invisible while mediocrity from Ethan was celebrated. One summer afternoon when I was 16, Ethan crashed my bicycle into a neighbor's mailbox. It was my birthday gift, something I had saved allowance money toward. But my father shrugged and said boys would be boys. "You'll get another," he told me, though none ever came. I walked to school that fall while Ethan drove a hand-me-down car my parents proudly called his first taste of responsibility. Responsibility. That word hung heavy on me, though it was never meant to. When I was 21 and in college, Ethan dropped out of community college after a semester. My parents covered it with excuses college isn't for everyone. He's more hands-on. They funneled money into his failed business schemes. a landscaping company that lasted 2 months, a used car lot that went bankrupt, an import-export idea that fizzled before it began. Each failure was cushioned by our parents. Each loss turned into a lesson they paid for gladly. Meanwhile, I worked part-time jobs, balancing studies and bills, sending money home when Mom claimed the mortgage was overdue. I remembered one phone call in particular, my mother sobbing that Ethan's credit card debt had spiraled, and they needed help making a payment to avoid losing the house. I wired the money, every cent I had saved, for a study abroad program. Later, I found out the house had never been at risk. Ethan had blown thousands on gambling trips to Oklahoma, and my parents had covered for him yet again. They never returned my money. I never studied abroad. By 25, I had graduated with honors and landed a job in Dallas. It was modest but steady, and for the first time, I felt proud of myself. I invited my parents to my apartment to celebrate my promotion, but they declined. "Ethan's been struggling," my mother said. "He needs us more right now." When I finally saw them weeks later, they brought up his troubles for hours, barely asking about my new role. That night, my father patted Ethan's shoulder and said, "Don't worry, son. You'll always be our pride." The final straw had come a few years before Grandma died. She had gathered us both in her living room, frail but sharp-eyed. She pulled out a thick envelope and pressed it into my hands. "This house will be yours, Victoria," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Ethan scoffed, and my parents exchanged glances, but Grandma didn't waver. "You've earned it. You've honored this family." My grandfather nodded, his eyes glassy but resolute. In that moment, I felt the first real recognition I had ever known. I didn't realize then how much that house meant. It wasn't just walls and roof, it was a verdict. A declaration that someone had seen me, valued me, chosen me. Ethan never forgave it. My parents never accepted it. And that night at the dinner table when he slapped me and they smiled, I finally understood they had been waiting years for their chance to erase Grandma's decision. These memories tangled together until I saw them clearly, a lifetime of favoritism, of sacrifices demanded from me, and excuses made for him. My childhood ribbon dismissed my bicycle, destroyed my savings, stolen my victories, ignored all bricks in the wall. They built to cage me as the strong one, the independent one, the one who needed nothing. And Ethan, the fragile, reckless golden child, was fed every resource, every ounce of sympathy, every second chance. But that night's humiliation lit a fuse in me. I was no longer the child waiting for applause, no longer the young woman wiring money to keep them afloat. I was the rightful heir, the one Grandma and Grandpa had chosen. They could gaslight, they could slap, they could smile while I bled, but the truth was written in ink, sealed in documents stronger than their denial. The flashbacks ended not with tears but with resolve. I saw myself not as the victim of their neglect, but as the keeper of my grandparents' legacy. The house was more than inheritance. It was proof that I had always been enough, even when my parents tried to convince me otherwise. And if Ethan and my parents thought they could take it from me with a slap and a smile, they had no idea what kind of war they had just started. The memory of that envelope my grandmother had pressed into my hands returned sharper than ever, as if the paper itself still burned through my skin. I could see the neat handwriting on the outside for Victoria and the tremor in her fingers when she gave it to me. At the time, I had thought it was just a letter, maybe a few keepsakes. I hadn't understood the weight of it until the lawyer sat across from me. Weeks later, his voice steady as he explained the contents. My grandparents in their will had left the family estate, the house Ethan now claimed as his to me. Not jointly, not conditionally, solely to me. There was no ambiguity. The wording was meticulous to our granddaughter, Victoria Harris, in gratitude for her loyalty, perseverance, and the dignity with which she has carried our name. Ethan's name appeared nowhere. My parents were listed only as beneficiaries of minor heirlooms, small tokens that reflected what little trust my grandparents had left in them. When the lawyer finished, I remember feeling both disbelief and relief. For once in my life, someone had seen me, valued me, rewarded me. I hadn't asked for the house. I hadn't even dared to imagine being chosen. Yet they had chosen me deliberately, unequivocally, but that decision had consequences. From the moment the will was read, my parents' faces hardened. My mother pursed her lips and muttered something about fairness. My father's jaw tightened, his silence more cutting than words. Ethan exploded, storming out of the office, his chair screeching against the floor. Later, my mother called me and begged me to do the right thing to share the house with Ethan. "He's fragile," she said. "You're strong, you'll be fine anywhere. Don't be selfish." It was the same refrain I had heard my whole life, but this time it was different. This wasn't a bicycle or a study abroad program or an overlooked birthday. This was my grandparents' final word, their last chance to set the scales straight. For once, I wasn't invisible. For once, the choice was mine. I held my ground. I told my parents no. I told Ethan no. The house was mine, and I would honor the legacy of the people who had actually loved me. Still, they never accepted it. My mother called it a misunderstanding, claiming Grandma had been confused. My father suggested the lawyer had made a clerical error. Ethan, emboldened by their denial, began treating the estate as though nothing had changed. He moved into the house within weeks, redecorating, holding parties, boasting to friends about his home. I tried to reason with him at first. I showed him copies of the documents. I offered him time to move out, offered to help him find another place. He laughed in my face. "Paper means nothing," he said. "Mom and Dad are on my side. This house will never be yours as long as I live in it." The dinner slap had only sealed that promise. His hand across my face, his voice claiming the house as his. My parents smiling their approval. It was all part of the same denial that had begun the day the will was read. They couldn't erase the ink, so they tried to erase me instead. But the truth was in my hands. Legal documents notarized and filed, waiting like a weapon. My grandparents' voices echoed through every line, reminding me that this wasn't just about walls and a roof. It was about validation, about justice, about finally breaking the cycle of being overlooked and discarded. They wanted to rewrite history at that dinner table, but history had already been written in law. And soon I would show them that no slap, no smile, no lie could change that. The slap at dinner had been shocking, but it was only the opening act. Ethan's rage didn't end at the table. It followed me through the halls of the estate like a storm refusing to break. After that night, I stopped visiting. Still, the house was mine. On paper, and I clung to that fact like a lifeline. I thought maybe time would soften things, that my parents would eventually accept the will that Ethan would burn himself out. But instead, the violence escalated. It began with my things. I had left a few boxes in the attic, photo albums, some childhood books, my grandmother's quilt. When I returned one afternoon to collect them, I found the attic door locked. Ethan stood in the hallway with his arms crossed, smirking. "Nothing of yours here anymore," he said. "If you left it, it's mine now." When I insisted, he shoved me back, his hand pressing against my shoulder so hard I stumbled into the wall. My parents stood nearby, silent witnesses. My mother finally sighed and said, "Victoria, don't make this harder than it needs to be." The next week, I tried again. This time, Ethan met me at the front door. His knuckles were white around a baseball bat, though he never lifted it. He just held it like a promise. "You step foot in here again," he said, his voice low, "and you'll regret it." My parents watched from the porch swing, not stopping him, not intervening, just rocking back and forth as though it were any ordinary evening. Word spread through the family quickly. Cousins who once smiled at me at gatherings stopped answering my calls. Aunts who used to ask about my job sent clipped texts telling me not to create drama. Ethan's version of the story, that I was trying to steal the house from him, became the narrative they all adopted. I was cast as the greedy outsider, the selfish one, the liar. Then came the final blow. One cold January afternoon, I drove up to the estate to find the locks changed. My key no longer fit. When I knocked, Ethan opened the door only wide enough for me to see his grin. "Guess you don't live here anymore," he said, and then he shut it in my face. I pounded on the door until my fists ached, shouting that the deed was in my name, that he had no right. But the curtains barely shifted, and no one came. I stood in the freezing wind, humiliated, knowing neighbors were watching. My breath turned to clouds. My tears froze on my cheeks, and all I could hear was Ethan's laughter echoing from the other side of the door. My parents called later that night, not to apologize, not to offer me a key, but to scold me. "Why would you show up like that?" my father demanded. "You embarrassed Ethan in front of the neighbors. You embarrassed us." My mother's voice was colder still. "We told you, Victoria, you're too dramatic. If you want peace, stop pushing. Let your brother handle things. He belongs in that house. You don't." Belongs. The word cut deeper than the slap. My own parents, the people who had raised me under that roof, had erased me entirely. I stopped calling after that. But the rage simmered. Each bruise from Ethan's shove, each bruise invisible, from my parents' gaslighting, became fuel. The humiliation of being locked out of my own home seared itself into me until it transformed into something stronger. That night alone in my Dallas apartment, I pulled out the folder the lawyer had given me. The will, the deed, the official filings, black ink on white paper, evidence that no slap, no bat, no lock could erase. My grandparents' voices whispered from the pages. "This house is yours. This legacy is yours." They thought they could expel me. They thought violence and silence would make me surrender. But they had underestimated me my entire life. That January night, staring at the papers spread across my coffee table, I made a silent vow I would not walk away this time. The next time I returned to that house, it wouldn't be to knock or beg. It would be to reclaim what was already mine with a force stronger than any of them could resist. Truth, law, and a resolve sharpened by years of their betrayal. The night I spread those legal documents across my coffee table, I realized something: I couldn't fight this battle alone. For years I had carried everything by myself: my studies, my bills, the endless attempts to prove my worth to a family that never wanted to see it. But now, facing Ethan's violence and my parents' denial, I needed people who believed me, who would stand beside me when my own blood turned away. The first person I called was Leah Thompson, my best friend since college. She answered on the first ring, her voice warm, steady like the anchor I hadn't known I needed. "What happened this time?" she asked, because she knew my family well enough to recognize the sound of crisis in my silence. I told her everything: the slap at dinner, the shove in the hallway, the locks changed on the house that was legally mine. By the time I finished, I was shaking, but Leah was calm. "You're not crazy," she said firmly. "They're gaslighting you, just like they always have. But this time, you have something they can't twist: documents, evidence, and you're not going to fight them alone." The next day, Leah drove from Austin to Dallas, showing up at my apartment with takeout and her laptop. She spent hours helping me sort through paperwork, scanning old emails, organizing bank transfers I had made over the years when my parents begged for help. Every pattern of their favoritism, every time you sacrificed. "They all left a trail," she said, tapping her keyboard. "We're going to make sure no one can deny what they've done." But Leah knew we needed more than organization. We needed the law. That's when she introduced me to Denise Caldwell, a sharp attorney she had met through a women's networking group. Denise was in her 40s with a presence that filled the room before she even spoke. She listened intently as I laid out the story, her eyes narrowing at each mention of Ethan's violence and my parents' complicity. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "You have more than just a moral case," Denise said. "You have a legal one. The will is ironclad. The deed is in your name. Changing the locks, intimidating you. Putting hands on you, that's trespass, that's assault, that's harassment. They think they can intimidate you into surrendering what's yours. But the law doesn't work that way, not if we use it correctly." Hearing her speak was like inhaling oxygen after years of suffocating. For once, someone wasn't telling me to stay quiet, to be strong, to let Ethan have his way. Denise was telling me to fight back, and not just emotionally, but strategically. She laid out a plan. First, gather every shred of documentation: the will, the deed, correspondence with the lawyer, evidence of my parents' attempts to pressure me into giving up the house. Second, file a legal notice to assert my ownership, making Ethan's occupation not just immoral, but officially unlawful. Third, prepare for escalation restraining orders, if necessary lawsuits, if they tried to retaliate. Evidence never blinks. Denise said, her voice crisp. They can lie, they can gaslight, they can scream. But paper doesn't flinch. Signatures don't change. That house is yours, and we're going to prove it in a way they can't laugh off at a dinner table. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something like hope. Sitting between Leah and Denise, surrounded by piles of scanned documents and highlighted notes, I wasn't just a daughter or a sister anymore. I was a woman preparing for battle, armed not with fists or shouts, but with truth and allies who believed in me. That night, Leah looked at me across the table and smiled. They always thought you'd be too isolated to fight back. But look at you now. You're not alone anymore. She was right. I wasn't alone. And that made me more dangerous than Ethan or my parents could ever imagine. Denise's words echoed in my head for days. Evidence never blinks. It became almost a mantra, one I whispered to myself as Leah and I dug through the wreckage of my past for proof that couldn't be ignored. We started with the physical. Leah set up her phone on a tripod in my apartment and told me to lift the sleeve of my sweater. I hesitated. The purple-yellow mark on my arm, where Ethan had shoved me, was ugly, a reminder I wanted to forget. But Leah shook her head gently. Don't hide it. Show it. This is what they did to you. She snapped pictures, zooming in on the bruises, making sure the timestamp was visible. Then she recorded me, describing what happened. My voice steady, but my hands trembling. He pushed me into the wall on December 10th, 2024. In the upstairs hallway of the Harris estate, I said into the camera. My parents were present. They did nothing to stop him. Next came the documents. Denise had me scan everything, the will, the deed, the official filings from probate court. She highlighted passages in yellow scribbling notes in the margins. This line here, she said, tapping a finger on the paper. It makes Ethan's occupation of the house unlawful. And this one, this proves your parents knew exactly what they were denying when they smiled at that dinner table. We went further. Leah helped me pull old bank records transfers I had made to my parents when they begged for help with Ethan's debts. Denise compiled them into a timeline showing how my sacrifices had funded his recklessness. This isn't just about the house, Denise said. This is about a lifetime of exploitation. A judge will see the pattern. A jury will feel the weight. Then there were the voicemails. My stomach twisted when I played them back, but Denise insisted we transcribe and save them. My mother's voice sweet on the surface, but laced with manipulation. He's fragile, Victoria. If you love this family, you'll give him the house. My father's voice colder. Don't embarrass us by making this a legal matter. You're stronger. He needs it more. Denise's eyes hardened as she listened. Perfect examples of coercion, she said. They'll regret leaving those messages. Leah also uncovered texts Ethan had sent in drunken rages. One read, "You set foot here again, and I'll make sure you regret it." Another, "The house is mine. Paper means nothing. I'll burn it down before you get it." I hadn't realized how damning they were until Denise printed them out, sliding the pages across the table. Seeing his threats in black and white stripped away the last trace of my guilt. We didn't stop there. Denise tracked down neighbors. Some willing to testify. They'd heard shouting, seen Ethan slam doors. Even watched him bar me from entering the estate. One neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, told Denise she'd seen me pounding on the locked door that January afternoon. She was crying, the old woman said. Her parents were right there on the porch, pretending nothing was wrong. It was cruel. Denise's smile was tight when she relayed it to me. People notice more than you think, she said, and they're not afraid to tell the truth. Piece by piece, the evidence mounted into something undeniable: bruises, documents, bank records, voicemails, texts, witnesses. Each fragment was a shard of the life I had endured. but together they formed a blade sharp enough to cut through every lie my family had spun. When we finished assembling the file, Denise placed it in a thick binder and slid it across the table toward me. "This isn't just paper," she said. "This is your shield and your sword. They can't gaslight paper. They can't slap a document. When we walk into that courtroom, you won't just be the forgotten daughter. You'll be the rightful heir. And the law will stand behind you." I ran my fingers over the binder's smooth surface, feeling the weight of it. For years I had begged for scraps of acknowledgement from my parents, proof that I mattered. Now I held something better, proof that could not be denied, that carried the force of truth and justice. Ethan thought he could erase me with a slap. My parents thought their silence would bury me. But evidence never blinks, and soon the world would see what they had done. Denise never rushed. She had the kind of patience that made you lean in, listening harder because you knew she wouldn't waste a word. When she finally laid out the plan, the room felt electric, charged with the kind of anticipation I hadn't felt since I was a child opening Christmas presents under my grandparents' tree. They think you're isolated, that you'll keep absorbing the blows until you disappear. Denise said, her tone measured but sharp. So we won't confront them in the shadows. We'll confront them in the spotlight where their lies crumble fastest. Leah leaned forward, her pen poised over a notepad. Where do we start? Denise tapped the binder we'd filled with evidence. Ethan is throwing another party at the estate. He wants to parade around in your house pretending he's the king of it. We're going to let him invite his audience. Then we'll show them the truth. At first, the idea terrified me. The thought of walking back into that dining room, into the lion's den, made my palms sweat. But Denise's calm presence steadied me. She wasn't asking me to fight with fists or screams. She was asking me to fight with proof. She explained the mechanics with precision. First, we'll file the legal notice with the county clerk. That makes your claim public record. Ethan won't know until it's too late. Second, we prepare certified copies of the deed, the will, and the restraining order draft. If he so much as raises a hand that night, the police will have cause to act immediately. Leah's eyes sparkled with something that looked dangerously like delight. So when Ethan tries to humiliate her in front of everyone, he's the one who ends up exposed. Exactly, Denise replied. We don't just win, we shift the narrative. Every cousin, every neighbor, every business associate sipping his champagne will see him for what he is. Not a host, but an intruder. Not an heir, but a thief. We rehearsed like soldiers before a battle. Leah role-played Ethan sneering and shouting, while I practiced staying calm, speaking with measured authority. Denise drilled me on the exact lines to deliver, each one short, sharp, impossible to twist. The house is in my name. Here is the will notarized and filed. Your occupation is unlawful. Each time I said the words, my voice grew stronger, steadier. For once, I wasn't shrinking. I was expanding, filling the space that had always been denied to me. The night before the party, Denise handed me a slim leather folder. Inside were the documents neatly organized and labeled. You won't need to raise your voice, she said. The truth speaks louder than a shout. Let Ethan rage. Let your parents smile their cruel smiles. When the time comes, you'll lay this on the table, and the weight of it will silence the room. I took the folder in my hands, its leather smooth and cool, and felt something shift inside me. For years I had been the forgotten daughter, the scapegoat the one sent outside while the golden child basked in the glow. Now I was walking back in, not to beg, not to explain, but to claim what had always been mine. Leah squeezed my hand, her grin fierce. Tomorrow you won't be walking into their house. They'll be standing in yours. That night, for the first time in months, I slept without waking in a cold sweat. Tomorrow was the party. Tomorrow was the unveiling. Tomorrow was the beginning of the end. The estate glittered that evening, its windows glowing like beacons across the manicured lawn. Cars lined the drive, laughter spilled out onto the porch, and the sound of crystal glasses clinking floated through the air. Ethan had outdone himself, turning my grandparents' home into a stage for his latest performance. He stood at the center of it all in a tailored suit, shaking hands, slapping backs, grinning as if the house itself pulsed with his blood. Leah walked beside me, steady as a shadow, while Denise trailed just behind, a quiet storm contained in heels and a navy blazer. My heart pounded in my chest, but my grip on the leather folder was tight. Every step up the marble stairs felt like climbing out of the pit they'd shoved me into all my life. The moment we entered, heads turned. Some guests whispered. Others smiled politely, masking their curiosity. Ethan's grin faltered when he saw me, but only for a second. Then he strode forward, arms outstretched like a benevolent host welcoming an unwanted guest. "Well, well," he drawled, "look who decided to crawl back." His words dripped with mockery, but I kept my gaze steady. My parents appeared at his side almost instantly. My mother touched my arm lightly, the same touch she'd used when I was a child being scolded in public. "Victoria, don't make a scene," she whispered through clenched teeth. "Tonight is important. Don't ruin it." The old script, the same lines I'd heard for decades. But I wasn't playing my role anymore. I waited until the room quieted, until even the music seemed to hold its breath. Then I set the leather folder on the nearest table, opened it, and laid out the deed, the will, and the legal notice with slow precision. The shuffle of paper was louder than Ethan's laugh. "This house," I said, my voice carrying across the room, "is mine." A ripple went through the guests. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in, hungry for drama. Ethan barked a laugh, too sharp, too desperate. "Yours." "Don't be ridiculous. Everyone here knows I've been running this place for months." "Running it," Denise cut in smoothly, "isn't the same as owning it. And as of this week, Mr. Harris, you are officially trespassing. Your occupation of this property is unlawful." She produced the certified copy of the filing, holding it high enough for the nearest guests to see. Ethan's face reddened. He slammed his glass onto the table, red wine splattering across the white cloth like blood. "This is my house," he roared. "No," I said quietly but firmly, sliding the notarized will across the polished wood. "It was our grandparents' house, and they left it to me." Gasps cut through the room. My mother's face drained of color, her lips parting, as if she'd been caught in a lie. My father's jaw worked, but no words came out. For once, their silence didn't bury me, it buried them. Ethan lunged, grabbing the will, crumpling it in his fist. "Paper means nothing," he shouted, echoing the same words he'd sneered at me months ago. But Denise was ready. She pulled out the second certified copy and handed it to a neighbor standing closest. "Paper means everything," she said, her voice like steel. and there are plenty of copies. The neighbors stared, a murmurs rising, judgment spreading like wildfire. Ethan's hands shook as he threw the crumpled document aside. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, his rage folding in on itself as the crowd began to see through the mask. My mother finally spoke, her voice thin. "Victoria, please, think about what you're doing. Families don't air their dirty laundry in front of strangers." I turned to her, my chest rising with the weight of years unshed. "You stopped being my family the night you smiled at my pain. Tonight isn't about laundry, it's about truth." The silence that followed was deafening. Guests glanced at one another, some already backing away from Ethan, from my parents, from the mess unraveling before them. The golden family facade cracked, splintered, and fell apart under the weight of evidence and exposure. Ethan screamed again, incoherent, and when he took a step toward me, Leah moved fast. She pulled her phone from her bag. Camera recording her voice steady. "Go ahead, Ethan. Show them who you really are." He froze, trembling, torn between rage and fear. And for the first time I saw it, the fragility my parents had coddled all these years. Without their protection, without their lies, Ethan was nothing but a man-child caught in the act of theft. I gathered the documents back into the folder, each page now heavier with vindication. My voice cut clean through the stunned crowd. This is no longer his stage. This is my home, and the law agrees. The fallout had begun, and it was only the beginning. The room was still vibrating with the shock of exposed truth when the front doors swung open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside their radios, crackling faintly, their presence slicing through the chaos like a knife. Denise had timed it perfectly. She had filed the notice earlier that week and flagged the sheriff's office in anticipation of tonight's fireworks. Evening one officer said, scanning the crowd before fixing his gaze on Ethan. "We've had reports of unlawful occupancy and threats of violence on this property. Mr. Harris, you'll need to come with us." The color drained from Ethan's face. He stumbled back, his bravado evaporating as fast as the champagne bubbles in his abandoned glass. "This is a mistake," he sputtered, his voice cracking. "It's my house, they're lying." The officer's partner took the crumpled will from the floor, smoothed it against his palm, and glanced at Denise's certified copy. "Doesn't look like it," he said flatly. Guests whispered, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads. The same people who had clinked glasses with Ethan minutes earlier now edged away from him, unwilling to be tainted by his downfall. My parents rushed forward, their voices trembling with desperation. My mother clutched at the officer's arm. "Please, he's fragile. You don't understand. He's been under so much stress." The officer gently pulled free. "Ma'am, stress doesn't excuse unlawful trespass or assault. The law is clear." My father tried a different tactic, his voice booming in the hollowed-out silence. "This is a family matter. You can't just drag my son out like a criminal." Denise stepped in, her voice precise as a scalpel. "With respect, sir." The moment he put his hands on my client and changed the locks on property that wasn't his, it became more than a family matter. It became a crime. Ethan's eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for allies. But no one stepped forward. Not one cousin, not one neighbor, not even my parents could shield him now. He was alone, just as he had tried to make me. When the officers cuffed him, The clink of metal echoed like a verdict. His protests turned into a shrill whine, his once commanding presence shrinking into something pitiful. They guided him toward the door, his voice breaking on the words he'd screamed at me months ago. "Get out of my house." Only this time, everyone in the room knew it was a lie. My parents stood frozen, their faces gray with shame. My mother whispered my name, her tone fragile in a way I had never heard before. But I didn't answer. I had nothing left to give. Instead, I looked at the crowd, every witness who had seen the mask shatter tonight. For years, I was told to stay quiet, to be strong, to let him have everything because he was fragile. But strength isn't silence. Strength is standing here now with the truth in plain sight. No one spoke. The silence was heavier than any applause, more validating than any cheer. It was the silence of reckoning, of walls collapsing, of false legacies burning to ash. As the doors closed behind Ethan and the officers, I felt the air shift inside the estate. It no longer belonged to him. It no longer belonged to my parents. It belonged to me, not just because the documents said so, but because I had claimed it finally and irrevocably. The final confrontation was over, but the true aftermath was just beginning. The morning after the party, the estate felt like an entirely different place. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating the worn rugs and portraits that had watched over my family for generations. For once, the air wasn't heavy with unspoken judgments or whispered demands. It was quiet still, almost reverent. I walked slowly through the halls, my fingers brushing the wood paneling, the banisters, the frames, all the details my grandparents had cherished. For the first time, I felt like I belonged. Ethan was gone, released into the custody of lawyers and court dates. My parents had retreated into silence, unwilling to call, unwilling to confront the wreckage of the lies they'd helped sustain. I didn't expect an apology anymore. What could they say that would undo decades of dismissal? Their absence was answer enough, but I wasn't alone. Leah stayed by my side that first week brewing coffee in my grandmother's kitchen, helping me air out rooms, coaxing laughter from me. When I didn't think I had any left, Denise came often too, updating me on the legal process. She explained the restraining order against Ethan, the restitution claims, the protective measures to ensure he couldn't set foot on the property again. The law is slow, she told me, but when it lands hard. He won't wriggle free this time. Each update felt like a weight lifting. For so long, I had carried bruises that no one wanted to see, burdens that no one wanted to acknowledge. Now every document filed, every boundary enforced, was proof that the world was finally willing to see me. Still, healing wasn't just about the law. It was about reclaiming myself. I started small, unpacking the attic boxes Ethan had tried to keep from me. I spread my grandmother's quilt across my bed, its patchwork colors, a reminder of the nights she'd tucked me in when my parents couldn't be bothered. I opened the photo albums, tracing the edges of pictures where my grandparents had smiled only at me, their eyes soft with pride. For years I had questioned whether I was worthy of that pride. Now, holding those photos, I knew I was. Leah encouraged me to write about it. At first, I resisted, too raw, too painful, but slowly I began jotting down memories, details, the moments that had defined my silence and my strength. I wrote about the slap, about the bruises, about the laughter that had cut deeper than fists. And then I wrote about the evidence, the plan the night the house was reclaimed. With every word, I felt the story shift from wound to scar, from something that hurt me to something that might heal someone else. It was Leah who suggested the next step. "Why don't you start a group?" she asked one afternoon, her eyes bright with possibility. "There are so many people, women especially, who go through this kind of betrayal. Family gaslighting, golden child favoritism, violence hidden behind closed doors. They need to hear that it's survivable." The idea rooted itself in me. Within weeks, I organized a small circle at the local community center. We called it Quiet Strength, a place for people to share stories that had been silenced for too long. The first meeting was just 6 of us sitting in a circle of folding chairs. But the air in that room was thick with honesty, with pain and hope braided together. I listened as women spoke of siblings who drained their savings, parents who looked the other way, partners who dismissed their bruises. And when my turn came, I told them mine. I didn't sugarcoat it. I spoke about the humiliation of being slapped in front of my family, about my parents smiling, while I cried about being locked out of the home that was legally mine. But I also told them about Denise, about Leah, about the binder of evidence, and the night the mask fell away. I told them that justice isn't always fast, and it isn't always pretty, but it's possible. By the end of the meeting, we were all crying, but they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of recognition, of release. We were no longer alone. Months passed. The court finalized Ethan's restrictions, cementing my ownership of the estate. My parents tried one last time to reach out, a terse letter, asking for understanding and hinting at reconciliation. But I didn't respond. Forgiveness wasn't mine to give when there had never been accountability. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply done. Instead, I poured my energy into restoring the house, not to its former glory, but to something new. The parlor became the meeting room for Quiet Strength. My grandmother's garden bloomed again under my hands, a riot of color and scent that felt like a conversation with her across time. The dining table, once a stage for cruelty, now hosted laughter and meals with people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could endure. On the anniversary of my grandmother's death, I stood on the porch at sunset, the house behind me, glowing warm with light and voices. Leah pressed a mug of tea into my hand. Denise raised a toast, and for the first time in my life, I felt full. Not just of survival, but of peace. I had spent years begging to be seen by the wrong people. Now I didn't need their gaze. I had my own reflection, my chosen family, my community. I had strength that was quiet but unshakable, and as I looked out over the estate, the place that had nearly broken me, I smiled. Because it hadn't. It had made me whole.